crisis. The bombing should stop now. Mr. Speaker, we also put on record our thanks to Pakistan and other partners for playing such an important role in diplomatic efforts. We hope the process will continue without further escalation. And that applies to the running sore that is the Strait of Hormuz, shamefully exploited by Iran. All of the leaders that I met were crystal clear that freedom of navigation is vital and must be restored. No conditions, no tolls, and no tolerance of Iran holding the world's economy to ransom. Because, Mr. Speaker, the impact of Iran's behaviour in the Strait is causing untold economic damage. It's visible on every petrol forecourt in the country. My guide from the start of this conflict has always been our national interest. That's why we stayed out of the war and why we continue to stay out of the war. And that is why we are working now to restore freedom of navigation in the Middle East, because that is squarely in our national interest. Now, Mr. Speaker, quite clearly, this is not a straightforward task. It will take time. I met UK businesses in energy, shipping, insurance and finance, and they are clear that vessels will not be put through the Strait until they are confident that it's safe to do so. And that's why we're working around the clock on a credible plan to reopen the Strait. And, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that together with President Macron, I will convene a summit of leaders this week to drive forward the international effort we have built in recent weeks, bringing together dozens of countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The summit will be focused on two things. First, diplomatic efforts to bring pressure to bear for a negotiated end to the conflict and for the Strait to be opened. Second, military planning to provide assurance to shipping as soon as a stable environment can be established. And let me be very clear, this is about safeguarding shipping and supporting freedom of navigation once the conflict ends. Our shared aim here is a coordinated, independent, multinational plan. This is the moment, Mr. Speaker, for clear and calm leadership. And notwithstanding the difficulties, Britain stands ready to play our part. Mr. Speaker, let me now return to the impact of this conflict on our economy. We all know that the consequences will be significant, and that they will last longer than the conflict itself. Now, we continue to monitor the effects, and I remind the House that energy bills went down on the 1st of April, and whatever happens in the Middle East, those bills will stay down until July. We're investing over £50 million to support heating oil customers, and fuel duty is frozen until September, all because of the decisions that this government took at the budget. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a wider point, because we can't stand here in this House and pretend that a global shock threatening to hit the living standards of British people is somehow a novel experience. Britain has been buffeted by crises for decades now, from the 2008 financial crash, through austerity, Brexit, COVID, the war that still rages in Ukraine, and the disastrous premiership of Liz Truss. The response each time has been to try to return to the status quo. A status quo, Mr. Speaker, that manifestly failed working people who saw their living standards flatline and their public services decimated. So this time, Britain's response must and will be different to reflect the changing world that we live in. That starts with our economic security, where during this conflict alone, we've capped energy bills, raised the living wage, strengthened workers' rights and ended the two-child limit that will lift nearly 500,000 children out of poverty. But, Mr. Speaker, looking forward, it also means a closer economic relationship with our European allies, because Brexit did deep damage to the economy. And the opportunities we now have to strengthen our security and cut the cost of living are simply too big to ignore. It continues, Mr. Speaker, with our energy security, where I say once again, oil and gas will be part of our energy mix for decades to come. But, Mr. Speaker, we do not set the global price for oil and gas. And households across the country are fed up with international events beyond their control, pushing up their energy bills, and I stand with them on that. So we will go further and faster on our mission to make Britain energy independent, because that is the only way we get off the fossil fuel rollercoaster and take control of our energy bills. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must strengthen our defence security. That means boosting our armed forces, as we have, with the biggest sustained investment since the Cold War. It means doubling down on the most successful military alliance the world has ever seen, the NATO alliance, of which this party in government was a founding member. But it also means strengthening the European element of that alliance, taking control of our continent's defence more robustly, deepening our partnerships, as we've done with our deals to build Norwegian frigates on the Clyde, Turkish Typhoons in Lancashire, not only, Mr. Speaker, creating thousands of secure jobs and opportunities for our defence industry right across the country, but also enhancing the way our armed forces can collaborate with our allies. Because, Mr. Speaker, as the Middle East conflict shows once more, the world in which we live has utterly changed. It is more volatile and insecure than at any period in my lifetime, and we must rise to meet it, calmly but with strength. That is exactly what we're doing at home and abroad. We are strengthening our security, taking control of our future, and building a Britain that is fair for all. And I commend the statement to the House.
Kevin Badenoch, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. I would also like to pay tribute to our brave servicemen and women serving in the Middle East right now. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right that Britain did not start this war, but whether we like it or not, we are impacted by it, and this is likely to get worse. The cost of borrowing has jumped, petrol prices are climbing, inflation is rising, and living standards falling. It is time to take decisive action in our national interest. Britain must focus on what is in our power to protect British citizens today. First, we must rapidly solve the energy crisis this war has caused in our country. And second, we must make sure that Britain is ready to defend herself in this new age. A nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat to the UK. We should be in no doubt whose side we're on in this war, our allies in the Middle East and the United States. So I welcome the Prime Minister meeting some of those allies, and I also welcome his support for diplomatic efforts and military planning to restore freedom of navigation in the region. But we will need to go further than just talking. He says Britain stands ready to play our part. We can all see that we were not ready for this situation. Here's what we need to do now. First, we must take rapid action to increase our energy security and keep bills down, not just until July, but longer than that, permanently. Britain is particularly vulnerable to energy price shocks because we are killing domestic oil and gas production in the North Sea. Labour's policy of more expensive energy and deindustrialisation at this time of crisis is dangerous and irresponsible. It is also harming the defence industry. We must start drilling our own oil and gas in the North Sea grant licences for drilling in the Jackdaw and Rosebank fields, and restore British production before it is too late. The Prime Minister says this won't impact international prices. This is more than international prices. This is about the domestic supply, especially of gas, all of which is used in this country. Supply matters. And finally, the government must cancel the proposed rise in fuel duty. Hiking taxes on motorists for the first time in 15 years, while prices are surging, is a disgraceful decision. If Britain is to be a stronger country, it needs a stronger economy, not one being hammered by the highest energy prices in the developed world. So, will the Prime Minister grant the oil and gas licences and scrap the rise in fuel duty? I know he'll say that it's the Energy Secretary's job. The Energy Secretary is not the Prime Minister. He is. He can instruct him to grant those licences. But, Mr. Speaker, secondly, to be ready, Britain must be able to defend herself. And that means we must be ready for these situations before they happen. France and Greece, they are. I don't know why they're laughing. I'm surprised they're laughing, because last time I checked, France and Greece sent ships to protect our bases in Cyprus while our destroyer was stuck in Portsmouth. It was a national embarrassment on their shoulders, and it should never happen again. We need no further evidence that we are living in a more dangerous world than a decade ago. I'm sure Labour MPs will try and think of a way to make this my fault. Let me remind them, yes, I know, it is preposterous, but let me remind them the historical illiteracy that is on those benches. Governments of all colours, including those guys there, spent the peace dividend from 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, until the Ukraine war. And when that war came, the Conservative government responded rapidly and unequivocally. We didn't have anything stuck in Portsmouth when Ukraine was invaded. We trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and equipped them with our missiles. We increased defence spending every year since the war started, but the world has since become even more dangerous. Every serious person, Mr. Speaker, every serious person, especially in the military, agrees that Britain must now find a way to spend 3% of GDP on defence by the end of this Parliament. After the election, many of the plans for spending were paused for Labour's strategic defence review. 9 months after publishing it, there is still no defence investment plan that explains how we will fund this. The Defence Readiness Bill is also nowhere to be seen. The question is not whether we need to increase defence spending. The question is what tough choices we must make to do so. That is what is missing from the government's plan. The government has a plan for welfare spending until 2031, but no plans for defence spending. So I say to the Prime Minister, let's put party interest aside. Yes. I'm glad that they're laughing, because I want the public to hear Labour MPs laughing when we say let's put party interest aside. So please keep laughing. Go on, please keep laughing. I say to the Prime Minister, let's find the money to rearm. Let's identify the spending cuts. And if we reach agreement on a joint plan, we can all support those measures in Parliament. Conservatives have already found savings to fund more than £20 billion extra for defence spending. I am willing to work with him to go further. And in his response, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Prime Minister will be tempted to misrepresent my position and pretend that I demanded he join in the initial strikes. Yeah, yes, I know they can't even resist the temptation. He and I both know that is not true. But let us get serious. Let's get serious. It is time for us to act decisively in our national interest. Let's show our allies what we bring to the table. Let's show our enemies that we are able and ready to defend ourselves. That requires a defence investment plan. So I ask the Prime Minister in conclusion, when exactly will the defence investment plan be published, and what action is he taking to find the money to pay for it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that her opening sentence has changed. She used to say, we didn't start the war, but like it or not, we're in it. Yep. And we should be in it. Yep. That was her position. Now she says, well, they can't make their mind up. They supported the war without thinking through the consequences, and now they're pretending they didn't support the war and they're against it all along. She challenged my position and she did the mother of all U-turns on the most important decision the Leader of the Opposition ever has to take. Can I thank her for her support for the planning that we're doing with other countries? It is important. It has a number of components, the political and diplomatic component, the logistics as well in terms of getting the vessels through, where we're working with the sector, and of course the military component. We've been working on that for 2 or 3 weeks now, and now bringing together with President Macron the summit later this week in that regard. In relation to energy bills, Mr. Speaker, yes, we all want to get energy bills down, and oil and gas will be part of the mix for many years. But it is because we're on the international market that our bills have gone up, and that is the problem. The Strait of Hormuz is a choke point for energy oil and gas getting to the international market. That's pushed the price up. That's being reflected in every household. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, the only way to take control of our energy bills is to go faster on energy independence. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition used to make that argument. In 2022, she said this: it is investment in nuclear and renewables that will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and keep costs down. She changes her mind on everything. That was her argument. And now just like she pretends she wasn't in favour of getting involved in the war, now she pretends she wasn't in favour of keeping costs down. And, Mr. Speaker, she says that we must be ready. That's coming from a party that hollowed out our armed services. Mr. Speaker, on their watch, frigates and destroyers were reduced by 25%. Mine-hunting ships reduced by 50% on their watch. And she lectures us about being ready, having hollowed out our armed forces and hollowed out our capabilities. We're investing £300 million more in shipbuilding, and we've got 13 ships on order. That, Mr. Speaker, is the difference between the two parties. And, Mr. Speaker, I hope that she and they will forgive me. After 14 years of breaking everything under their watch, I'm going to resist the offer of joint planning from the government, from the party that crashed the economy, hollowed out our armed forces, crashed our public services. Thanks, but no thanks.
Chair of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Affairs Committee has just come from a meeting with some of the Gulf ambassadors, who are genuinely grateful for the help that Britain has given defending their countries, and who also want to say how grateful they are that the Prime Minister visited the Gulf in an act of true solidarity. But when people heard the Israeli Defence Minister say that his war aims in Lebanon would follow the model in Gaza, our blood ran cold. Could the Prime Minister tell the House what role the United Kingdom can do to ensure a ceasefire in Lebanon, and that Israel is stopped from taking over Lebanon south of the Litani River?
Raising the important question of Lebanon, I want to be really clear in relation to that. That should be included in the ceasefire, and we're using every opportunity we can to make that argument. And please, there's some diplomacy at the moment, but those attacks should stop, and it's really important that we're very, very clear about that.
Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, and can I join him in what he said about the horrific attack in Southport? Our thoughts with the families of Bibi, Elsie and Alice, and with all those affected. Mr. Speaker, a whole civilization will die tonight. Words I never thought I would hear from an American president. And though Donald Trump thankfully didn't follow through this time, these words are a stark reminder of how reckless, immoral and completely outside the bounds of international law this president is. Regrettably, he is no friend of the United Kingdom. He is no leader of the free world. He is a dangerous and corrupt gangster, and that is how we must treat him. So will the Prime Minister advise the King to call off his state visits to Washington before it's too late? Because I really fear for what Trump might say or do while our King is forced to stand by his side. We cannot put His Majesty in that position. And when it comes to Trump's latest cunning plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, that will only escalate this crisis and jeopardise the precarious ceasefire. So it's right that the UK is not joining Trump. And I welcome the Prime Minister convening a summit to offer an alternative to Trump's. We must work with our reliable allies in Europe and the Commonwealth and our partners in the Gulf to bring this conflict to an end and keep open the Strait of Hormuz. That is critical for tackling the cost of living crisis that is getting worse and worse for people in the UK. With petrol prices now up by more than 25p a litre and diesel up 49p since Trump started this war, cheered on, let's not forget, by the leader of the Conservative Party and Reform, does the Prime Minister recognise that families and businesses can't wait months for the government to step in and help? So will he use the windfalls the Treasury is getting from higher fuel prices to cut the cost of living and keep the economy moving, with action to slash bus fares and rail fares and cutting fuel duty by 10p today, bringing down the price at the pumps by 12p a litre?
Can I thank him for his question? And in relation to the language about destroying a civilization, can I really be clear with this House? That was wrong. A threat to Iranian civilians in that way is wrong. These are civilians, let's remember, who've suffered immeasurable harm by the regime in Iran for many, many long years. And that's why they're words and phrases that I would never use on behalf of this government, which is guided by our principles and our values throughout all of this. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the King's visit, the relationship between our two countries is very important on a number of levels, and often what the monarchy is able to do through the bonds that they build is reach through the decades in a situation like this. And the purpose of the visit is to mark the 250th anniversary of the relationship between our country and the United States, and that's why the visit is going ahead. In relation to the blockade, let me be clear, as I've been already in the last day or so, that we are focusing our efforts on opening in full the Strait of Hormuz because of the damage it's doing to economies around the world, including our own economy. That is why we've been working with other countries at various levels, and we'll bring them together in a summit later this week. And we, the UK, will not be joining the blockade that the President announced. In relation to the help that is needed to families and households, obviously we've put in place help for energy bills already and oil heating that is in place. But, Mr. Speaker, we're keeping this under constant review as the situation evolves. The single most important and effective thing we can do is to de-escalate the situation and work with others to get the Strait of Hormuz open. And that is why we're focusing so much of our efforts in that regard.
Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for confirming that despite the significant unwelcome trolling and pressure from President Trump and Israeli PM Netanyahu, that the UK is not being dragged into this war and it is not in our national interest. Given that the US has now initiated the blockade of Iranian ports, can the Prime Minister confirm what steps are being taken to help de-escalate the situation, whether it's to reopen the Strait of Hormuz so that goods can transit freely and that we can ease the cost of living pressures for our constituents, and also what is being done to help de-escalate the situation in Lebanon? And can he also confirm that any future UK involvement in the region will be strictly limited to defensive purposes only?
Well, can I thank him and reiterate that we will not be dragged into the war. In relation to the steps we're taking, they're across a number of levels. It was central to the discussions I had in the Gulf states last week in terms of what we can do together to de-escalate. Mr. Speaker, they are shocked and angry, frankly, that they have been attacked in the way that they have been attacked. They were not involved in the conflict, and it's clear to them that they were targeted within hours of the beginning of this conflict starting, and civilian infrastructure and civilians were targeted as well. And they're absolutely clear that that targeting was put in place before the conflict started. So we're working with them. We're working across the coalition of dozens of countries now to de-escalate and to get the Strait of Hormuz open just as soon as it's viable and credible to do so.
Front of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
The Prime Minister may recall that on day one of this war I supported his defensive attitude to it and said we couldn't change the regime from the air, and he agreed. He's been proved right. But with apologies to Leon Trotsky, we may not be interested in war, but war is interested in us. So we all agree we have to rapidly rearm. The trouble is that with the ever-increasing proportion of our entire economy taken by the state pension and by benefits, perhaps we can't afford to do it. So will you work with the Leader of the Opposition to take the necessary, perhaps unpopular decisions to return defence spending to what we spent in 1989, the end of the Cold War?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise this, and we've already raised defence spending, as he knows, in the most significant way since the Cold War. I've been clear in the Munich Security Conference that I gave a few weeks ago that we need to go further and faster, and we will. I think in addition to the funding itself, I think it's really important that we take this opportunity to collaborate and cooperate with our partners, particularly in Europe, because if all European countries simply increase their spending without regard to the capability that they're using that spending on, we won't make the best of what we've got. And therefore, I'm making a dual argument, one in relation to the actual money we spend, but secondly, the way we need to collaborate in a way we haven't done, frankly, for decades in relation to this with our allies, particularly in Europe.
Nora Ali.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's call for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire. 1,700 people have already been killed by Israeli attacks, and over 1.1 million people have been displaced. At a time when aid budgets have been cut, including by our own government, will the Prime Minister commit to playing that international leadership role, as he is doing in relation to getting a ceasefire, working with our European partners and others, to support the humanitarian effort and increase support to those who are being displaced in the region, but also think about how we support countries in the global south that are now going to be hit very hard because of this crisis, because the impact of that will affect all of us if we don't take action at the international level.
Well, can I thank you for raising this really important issue and be clear, Lebanon must be included in the ceasefire, and it's very important that we are clear about the principle behind that. I also accept that there must be more support on the humanitarian front. We've just put more money into the humanitarian support, but it's clearly a cause of concern in Lebanon, actually, and in wider areas, as she rightly points out.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Prime Minister should acknowledge, I'm sure that he does, that over the last 30 years our armed forces have been hollowed out by governments of all parties as they have sought to take a peace dividend. But I'm afraid the chickens have come home to roost on his watch. So will he now commit to a huge and immediate uplift in defence spending, not just by vaporising British soft power expenditure? We are talking of moving towards a 5% increase so that the government can play a full part in European defence and deliver on its first duty to its own citizens.
Well, I agree that our armed forces now capable is hollowed out over many years. In particular under the last government, I'm afraid to say. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, then Defence Secretary, was very clear about that. But he's right to say now is the point at which we've got probably more conflict going on in the world now than most of us have seen in our lifetimes. And that's why we have to increase defence spending. That's why we took the decision to increase to 2.5% sooner than people thought we would, and that's already taking place. I made commitments at the NATO summit last year in relation to the further spending that we need to put in place. I stand by those commitments. We must go further and we must go faster.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, let me say that thank you to the Prime Minister for your statesmanship. This weekend saw the Pakistani government step up and take global leadership by expertly hosting and mediating negotiation between Iran and America. The whole world is indebted to the noble efforts of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar, and General Syed Asim Munir to achieve a ceasefire. Given Pakistan is a long-term ally of Britain, will the Prime Minister outline what support he is giving the Pakistani government facilitate an agreement for long-lasting peace and stability in the Middle East?
Can I reiterate my thanks to Pakistan for the role that they're playing? And I can tell the House that I spoke to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Friday as we're going into the talks this weekend about the talks about what support we could put in place. And the Foreign Secretary spoke to her counterpart this afternoon. It's very important that we support this process and try to move it forward and not to let it escalate.
Stephen Flynn.
The Prime Minister is absolutely right to condemn the abhorrent response of the terrorists in the IRGC, but I noticed from his statement that there's no explicit condemnation of the illegality of Donald Trump's actions. There's no explicit condemnation of the illegality of Netanyahu's actions. And despite having the entire Easter break to think about it, there is explicitly no new financial support for households on these isles whatsoever, despite the fact that in Ireland they've put down €750 billion worth of support for motorists and farmers. The best he can muster is to continue to monitor the effects. Now, I appreciate that he might not be in office for very much longer, but whilst he is, the public expect him to provide support. Why isn't he?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll remind him that we put in support and protection for our citizens in the region by taking defensive action. He opposed that. Protection for Scottish citizens in the Gulf, and they opposed taking any action whatsoever. It is only because we've stabilised the economy we're able to reduce energy bills. What did they do? They voted against the budget in which we put forward the money for this. So we will carefully do the work that we need to do, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which is the single most effective thing we can do in relation to household costs, and to work for de-escalation. I would have thought that he would have supported that, but unfortunately, again, he's on the opportunistic road rather than the road to support what we really need to do.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I thank my right honourable friend for all that he's doing towards de-escalating the conflict in the Middle East, and also to agree with him in terms of not getting drawn into this conflict. But could I ask him about Palestine, and particularly the West Bank? Does my right honourable friend agree with more than 30 former UK ambassadors that any bidder for contracts to design, build or finance the E1 settlement expansions should endanger their business interests in and with the UK?
Well, can I thank you for raising this, and it's very important that we don't lose focus on what's happening in the West Bank. It is deeply concerning and deeply worrying, and in relation to the E1 settlements, I made the position clear, I think, the week before last, and that remains the position.
Sir Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a crisis, governments have permission to do things that are not possible in normal times. But I'm worried that what the Prime Minister is going to bring forward will not meet the measure of the moment. Can he commit to the House that when it comes to energy policy, he will dramatically change it so that it focuses as much on cheap energy as clean energy? And when it comes to the desperate need to increase defence spending, will he look at serious welfare reform that stops someone who is earning the national living wage working full-time, sometimes only getting half as much as someone on the three main benefits?
Can I thank him for his question? In relation to the cost of energy, yes, of course, we have to focus on the cost of energy. And there's simply no denying the fact that it's because we're on the international market that our energy prices are going up and down. And families across the country are really fed up with the fact that international events happen which they can't control, and energy bills go up and down, causing a cost of living crisis. That is because we're on the international fossil fuel market. There's no denying that. And that will be the case so long as we're on that market, because that controls the price. Putin and Iran control the price of the international market, and the longer we're on it, the more our families will be subjected to that. We have to take control of energy bills. The only way to do that is through energy independence. It's the only way to do it, and that's why I think we need to double down on going faster and further in relation to that. Yes, of course, oil and gas will be part of the mix for many years to come. I've been very clear about that, but equally clear that that won't have an effect on the price and the cost of energy bills. The only thing that will have an effect on the price and cost of bills is coming off the international market that we're stuck with. That's why the Strait of Hormuz is so important. We don't get that much energy in oil and gas coming out of or coming through the Strait, but it's because we're on the international market that we're impacted by the fact that others do. That is the source of the problem. That's why we're working so hard to resolve it.
John Trickett.
Sir, and can I echo the comments about the President's statement on Easter Sunday, that in an evening he could destroy a 2,500-year-old civilization. But on the question of the Straits of Hormuz, isn't it clear that the Straits were open before the President foolishly launches illegal war? And can I ask the Prime Minister to say quite clearly that no British military assets or brave personnel would be put at risk in a foolish idea to blockade the Straits even further, which came from the President yesterday?
Thank you for that. It is, of course, Iran that's putting in the chokehold on the Strait. That is wrong, and the strength of feeling across the Gulf last week was very, very clear to me. I can assure him that we are not getting involved in the proposal to blockade the Strait. On the contrary, we're working with other countries to try and get the Strait open and fully open for free navigation, something this country has championed for years and years and years.
Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the US President impersonated Jesus Christ. Last week, he pledged to wipe out an entire civilization. His warmongering in the Middle East is piling on the pressure for my constituents in East and Wharton, from prices at the pump to mortgage increases in the midst of a cost of living crisis. So given the disturbing utterances from the occupant of the White House and the squeeze on our living standards, surely the future is across the channel towards Europe. And I note that the Prime Minister gave a line, presumably for the local elections, about alignment with Europe, but could he give more detail on what this means for defence and for security and for prosperity?
Well, a close relationship with the EU and Europe was in our manifesto in 2024, which was a very successful manifesto. And we've been working to that end ever since, which is why we had the first UK EU summit last year with agreed 10 strands. It's why I've been clear that we want to go further this year, not just in seeing where we've got to on what we've already agreed, but going further than that, because it is in our interest, whether it's defence, security, energy or the economy, to be closer to Europe, and that's what we're endeavouring to do.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and welcome his convening of a summit of leaders alongside President Macron. Mr. Speaker, the situation in Lebanon is devastating. Israeli escalation has led to a grave humanitarian situation. The images of civilians being carpet-bombed are horrifying. I want to reiterate what the Foreign Affairs Committee heard today. We met with ambassadors from the Gulf. They expressed their genuine appreciation for the Prime Minister's presence and Britain's continuing support. Can I ask the Prime Minister to continue to represent the voices of our constituents and to resist escalation, include Lebanon in the ceasefire, and to press for peace?
Can I assure her we'll make the case for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire, and we will continue with our work to de-escalate and not get drawn into this war?
Kit Moulton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all hear the Prime Minister's words about Lebanon, but surely the lesson of the last 2.5 years is that his words and the words of anybody in this House have no impact on an Israeli government seemingly led by supremacist maniacs. Now, before Easter, I asked the Foreign Secretary how many Lebanese was an acceptable number to see killed over the coming weeks, and we've learnt over the Easter break that there's seemingly no upper limit before we're willing to act. So I wanted to ask the Prime Minister a simple question. Given that he proudly, quite rightly, proudly pointed to the part Britain is playing in defending other nations in the region, Why have we not stepped forward to defend Lebanese civilians in the same way that we have others? And secondly, a simple question, if you can't answer that one, does Lebanon have a right to exist?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to him for raising this really serious issue, and I think the immediate focus has to be ensuring that Lebanon is in the ceasefire and being absolutely clear in our condemnation of the action that Israel is taking. We are working on that on a number of levels, but I always believe and continue to believe that we are stronger when we work with other countries, and that's what we're endeavouring to do.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for my honourable friend for his statement, and I note the emphasis he has on the no return to the status quo, particularly in relation to the importance of energy independence. Will he acknowledge that we are now entering a new energy era, and perhaps he agrees with President von der Leyen, who today has said, "Here is one thing that all these events are making clear. We are paying a very high price for our over-dependency on fossil fuels. And the grim reality for our continent is fossil fuel energy will remain the most expensive option in the years to come."
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's the argument that I've been making, and I believe to be right. It's the argument the Leader of the Opposition used to make, but she's U-turned on that as well.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All our constituents are worried about the price of energy, the price of gas. But is the Prime Minister aware that the price of gas in the US has fallen 20% since the start of this war, while the price of gas in the UK has increased by 50%, proving, Prime Minister, that if we produce and consume our gas domestically, we can have much lower bills, proving why we must allow the consents for Jackdaw, for Rosebank and all of the oil fields across the North Sea and onshore as well.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I remind myself that his party's position was to fully support the war, go in with both feet, whatever the consequences. Now he says there are these consequences. Well, they should have thought about that before they adopted the policy of going straight in. But, Mr. Speaker, on the question of energy and gas, yes, the price is subject to the international market because we're on the international market. That is why the sooner we have energy independence, the better.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Trump's illegal war on Iran and his genocidal threat to kill a whole civilization are part and parcel of a dangerous new US security plan. The Trump doctrine is based upon yet more war and tearing up international law, making the whole world less safe. Prime Minister, given that, isn't it time for Britain to stop being a junior partner to the US and pursue a truly independent foreign policy? And shouldn't the very first step be to end all US access to British military bases for Trump's war on Iran?
We have British civilians in the Gulf region, about 300,000, and they are at risk because of Iran's actions, and it's my duty to ensure that we protect them. That is why we've taken action in our own right, particularly with our pilots. It is also why I've allowed the bases to be used for defensive purposes to prevent those attacks on our civilians as much as anything else who are in the region. And I'm never going to abandon them to their fate when there is incoming missiles and drones into the areas where they are living and where they are working. It's my duty to protect them, and I'll continue to do so.
Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Prime Minister just remind some of his colleagues that the United States is a democracy and an ally, and Iran is an odious regime that could have ended the war this weekend had they agreed to give up their ambitions for nuclear weapons and to cease supporting their proxy terrorist organisations around the Middle East? And wouldn't it be helpful if the Prime Minister said a bit more criticism of the Iranian regime rather than supporting his colleagues and criticising the United States?
Mr. Speaker, in fairness, I've been very clear about the Iranian regime. It is odious, as he rightly points out. It is really important that they do not have the nuclear capability and that we deal with their proxies. And that has been the consistent position of this government and previous governments, to be fair, and it's been the way in which I put it from the dispatch box on many, many occasions.
Mr. Hamid Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his efforts to keep the UK out of Donald Trump's latest dangerous attempt to end a blockade by creating another. I also commend Pakistan's attempt to broker peace and the UK government's work with now over 30 countries to pursuit of a diplomatic solution. But if the strait remains closed, what plans does the government have to protect UK households and businesses from impact on energy supplies, trade and rising costs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're planning for all contingencies, but I emphasise once again that our absolute focus has to be on getting the strait open. Having spoken to shipping, finance, insurance, etc., they're very clear with me that they're not going to be putting vessels through whilst there is a conflict, and therefore we must de-escalate and come up with that credible plan. We will do that in conjunction with other countries, and that's why President Macron and I are convening the summit later this year, later this week, building on the work we've been doing over the last few weeks.
Mr. Speaker, in its statement, the Prime Minister said that he wanted to double down on NATO. But President Trump has attempted to use the NATO alliance or threat to withdraw from it to blackmail other NATO countries into joining his illegal endeavour in Iran. He's also threatened to annex the sovereign territory of another NATO member. He has said that NATO members weren't there for the US in Iraq. It is clear that the US is an unreliable partner in NATO. So will the Prime Minister announce when he is going to release the defence investment plan, and will he explain how we can forge closer ties with our European allies who are more reliable?
Mr. Speaker, let me thank you for his question. And the first thing I'd say is it's very important that we defend NATO. It's the single most effective military alliance the world has ever known, and we should do nothing to weaken it. I do think that there should be a stronger European element on defence and security. It's an argument I've been making for some time. It's particularly important now that Europe steps up with a stronger European element, and we're working with our allies to do that.
Alison Newell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and his positive efforts on the issue of the Straits of Hormuz. Last week, I met with farmers in Whitby who are deeply concerned about the skyrocketing price of red diesel. In January, the fuel cost was 64 pence per litre, and it has since doubled. With the busiest period of the farming calendar approaching, can the Prime Minister outline what measures the government is considering to support farmers impacted by these rising costs?
Can I assure her that we have been looking at that in the various meetings we've been having, particularly the red diesel question, and looking at contingencies. But in addition to planning for those contingencies, it is really important that we double down on our work to de-escalate and to open up the Strait of Hormuz.
Tom Tugendhat.
Mr. Speaker, may I quote the Prime Minister, who told us just a few moments ago that the bills for energy are going to stay down until July, but he also correctly said that we do not set the global price for oil and gas. Is the Prime Minister making an enormous gamble on the energy price, and how much money has he set aside in order to ensure that bills stay down even if prices rise? I'm not sure if he's aware, but the last tanker to leave the Straits of Hormuz and bring fuel to the UK docked only a few days ago. The last tanker to arrive in the US waters will be arriving in a day or two, and after that we're on our own. Is he taking that bet, and who's going to pay for it?
Can I thank him for reminding the House that we are reducing energy bills. We have done that already by an average £100 per household, and that will remain the case until the end of June, until July of this year. It's very important that people hear that message, because they are concerned, and they're concerned to know that that will be the case whatever happens in the conflict, and it is. That decision was taken as a result of what we did at the budget last year, where we were able to stabilise the economy and provide the money for it, because we're bearing down on the cost of living.
Paul Wall. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for refusing to allow the UK to be dragged into America's
America's war in Iran, a war that's hitting my constituents directly in the pocket and at the petrol pumps. But he rightly mentioned the people of Palestine earlier. And can I remind him that last week the former heads of Shin Bet and Mossad security services and former IDF chiefs of staff described the ongoing settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank as, I quote, government-sponsored Jewish terrorism, which is not only a moral disgrace but a fatal strategic blow to Israel's own national security. So can I urge the PM to condemn the settler violence, condemn Israel's refusal to tackle it, condemn Israel's expansion of illegal settlements, and also to back the Pope, who said that peace should be the priority?
Can I thank him for raising the question of settler violence, because it is disturbing, it is wrong, and it's escalated, as he knows better than most, and that's been our clear position, to call it out and to do everything we can in relation to that settler violence, which is getting worse by the day, not better by the day.
Mike Martin.
The crisis has laid bare the parlous state of the British military, and, Madam Deputy Speaker, the three main parties of government should put aside the blame game and accept that we all have played our part in getting the British military into the state that it's in now. For over a year, the Liberal Democrats have been asking for cross-party talks on how to get to 3%. I'm glad the Conservatives have now joined us. We've spoken about defence bonds. I'm sure the Conservatives have got ideas. I'm sure the government has ideas. Can we please, Madam Deputy Speaker, this could be the Prime Minister's legacy, can we please get together in the national interest and talk about how to increase defence spending?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do need to increase defence spending. I've been clear about that. But can I just make the case that our military have been hard at work throughout this conflict from within about 2 hours of the conflict starting. That means hours and hours of the pilots taking incoming missiles to safeguard our citizens, our interests and those in the Gulf. And when I was there last week, all of the leaders I met were at pains to thank us for what our military is doing. And we're too quick sometimes to run them down. They've done a lot of brave work, particularly in the last 6 to 7 weeks, and I thank them for that work.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for all his efforts, not least, of course, in the last few days. I'm a little concerned that because many of us have a difference with the way President Trump talks and the actions he's taken in terms of Iran, and obviously it's something we don't agree with on this side of the House, I am a little concerned that we shouldn't get mixed up in the fact between what President Trump says and his view and what the Congress and Senate think in the United States of America. Because when you talk to them, there is significant and overwhelming support for NATO and for Europe. And I think it's important we actually remember that, because our relationship in America is very, very important, not least in terms of NATO. And I hope that the Prime Minister will comment on that.
Can I thank him for that? And he's right to draw attention to the broad support there is for NATO in the United States, and always has been. And whilst it is true we should do more for a stronger European element in NATO, we should never pull away from NATO, which, as I say, has been the single most effective military alliance the world has ever known.
Afra Brandreth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The war in the Middle East is having a real effect on my constituents in Chester South and Eddisbury. From fuel to fertiliser, prices are increasing and action needs to be taken to alleviate the consequences. While there are immediate steps that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor should be taking, not least reversing the planned increase in fuel duty, the bigger picture involves reopening the Strait of Hormuz. What thought has been given to the role the UK can play in clearing the Strait of mines? And in particular, did the Prime Minister raise the potential deployment of our autonomous minesweeping capabilities, which are already in the region, during his discussions?
Can I thank her for her question? She's absolutely right in relation to opening the Strait and playing our part. There is the political and diplomatic element, but there is also the military capability. What we're doing with the countries that we've brought together in a loose coalition and will meet in person later this week is to look across those capabilities and draw them together. We do have capabilities when it comes to minesweeping. I won't go into operational details, but she knows what they are. And obviously, as we look across the board with President Macron and others, part of that exercise will be, and the military planners have been looking at this, to look at how we can pull together the capabilities of all the countries that are prepared to work with us on this. We've got at least a couple of dozen that we've been working with for the last 2 weeks, and we'll be doing that further this week.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's leadership
relationship in supporting our regional partners and our national interests, in particular that of free navigation. But this lies out with our most immediate security problem, which is defending Europe from Russian attack in all of its forms. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we should recognise Russian-Iranian cooperation and that we must not let this distract from our urgent need to collectively rearm and defend our country and the continent of Europe?
Well, can I thank him for drawing attention to this really important issue, which is the relationship between Russia and Iran and the assistance that Russia has given to Iran in relation to the intelligence that's being used during the conflict. And we must never lose sight of the fact that we're facing a war on two fronts, and Russia is a huge threat to our continent and to our country.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the Defence Investment Plan be signed before the local elections on the 7th of May?
Mr. Speaker, we're working to finalise the Defence Investment Plan. It's really important that we don't make the mistakes the last government made. We inherited plans which were unfunded and not deliverable. And it's really important, therefore, that our plan is robust. We're finalising it, but it will be a robust plan that serves for the future defence and protection of this country.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We now know that an agreement was about to be reached on the uranium enrichment by Iran. However, Israel decides to bomb Iran, as did the USA, joining and doing an illegal, immoral, dangerous war of choice. And even during the ceasefire, which included Lebanon, Israel continues to bomb South Lebanon and Beirut, displacing millions of people. This is typical of Israel. Just before an agreement is reached, it kills negotiators and bombs the countries. Now, these are not faraway conflicts. My constituents of Bolton South and Walkden are paying the price for it by higher fuel costs, raising mortgages and household bills. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what additional steps is he taking to help the constituents of my area, but also the country and the world to bring peace, unlike, of course, members opposite who seems to be finding it very amusing?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that is precisely why we're working with other countries to de-escalate the situation and get the Strait of Hormuz open. As I said in my statement, that is not going to be easy, but notwithstanding that challenge, we'll continue to do so.
Ellie Chance.
Deputy Speaker, in the Prime Minister's 17-page statement, there was not one word of condemnation of the actions of the US, despite the fact that they started this illegal war and that last week Trump threatened to wipe out an entire civilization. Now, the Prime Minister did rightly condemn the horrific Israeli attacks on Lebanon, but we all know that the war criminal Netanyahu just ignores what we say because there are no consequences. So will the Prime Minister take action, sanctions on Netanyahu, withdraw all permission for the US to use UK bases and UK airspaces to make clear that we will not be an accomplice to the rogue actions of Donald Trump, which endanger us all?
The US are using the basis to attack the Iranian capability to fire missiles into the region, including at our citizens and our nationals. You'll have seen the images going into hotels, going to the bases where our military are based. Is she seriously suggesting that we should reduce the protection for our people in the region and expose them to attacks they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to? That, to me, is a dereliction of duty, and I will never do that.
John McDonnell.
I actually think the House is at one with the Prime Minister with regard to the inclusion of Lebanon in the ceasefire. The problem that we face is that today there's been more airstrikes against the Lebanese, and the Israeli artillery are now shelling Lebanese cities and towns. And for many of us, we feel it is because Netanyahu actually is out of control, and Donald Trump is not willing to exert that control or influence to bring him into line. So can I suggest to the Prime Minister, in his next discussions with the European leaders that he's successfully convening, can he place on the agenda now a comprehensive European sanctions strategy so that we can exert some influence on preventing Netanyahu, as I say, running out of control and actually creating problems for the globe, not just the Middle East?
Can I thank him for his question? And clearly Lebanon should be included in the ceasefire. And let's be clear, these attacks must stop, and we need to be really clear about that, and we will work with our allies on both those issues.
Bernard Objective.
We know that the Defence Investment Plan was originally due to be published last year. As it's a 10-year plan, will it be a 10-year plan from publication in this financial year, 2026-27? And does that change the cost envelope? Is it a 10-year plan now or a 9-year plan in terms of the way it's being financed?
Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm so sorry. It's a 10-year plan. And it mirrors our strategic review. But of course, obviously, it sits alongside the defence spending commitments that we have made and we're implementing with the 2.5% and the commitments that I made at the NATO summit last year.
Absana Begum.
The House has repeatedly been told that the government has permitted the US to use British military bases for defensive purposes only. But amidst the widespread US targeting of civilian infrastructure in Iran, including schools, hospitals and bridges, we have not been told how these restrictions work in practice. Could the Prime Minister confirm whether the US military aircraft have taken off from RAF Fairford or Lakenheath carrying heavy munition payloads? If so, whether there is any US operational policy for action from our bases in place approved by this government? And if not, is it the case that the working definition of defensive action here is simply don't ask, don't tell?
Well, let me assure her in the House that isn't the position. It's for defensive action only. I'm particularly concerned to make sure we take every measure available to protect our nationals in the region. There are very many of them. Not only is it defensive action, but it's monitored and has been monitored since the bases began being used.
Dr Al Pinkerton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister is absolutely right to suggest that the tremors provoked by this conflict will reverberate long after the kinetic fighting has finished. And there's perhaps no greater example of that than in Cyprus, where government officials, all the way up to the level of the Prime Minister, have questioned Britain's continuing sovereignty over our sovereign base areas in Cyprus. So can I ask the Prime Minister what he has done to reassure the Cypriots, to reassure the Cypriot government that Britain is a trusted and reliable neighbour and partner, and that our continuing sovereignty is immutable?
Can I thank him for raising this and assure him I've spoken to the President a number of times in this regard about the basis, about security in particular, which is of course a concern to him and his public, and those discussions are ongoing.
Conor Naismith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This war, which we are rightly playing no part in, has my constituents fearing for the future, not least in terms of rising energy and fuel costs. And this underlines the crucial importance of bringing down the cost of energy and securing energy independence. But will the Prime Minister reassure my constituents in Crewe and Nantwich that while this government is rightly taking the necessary steps to provide us with long-term energy security through renewable energy and new nuclear, that the government will go further in the short term to tackle some of the profiteering that is happening and to directly support hard-pressed families and small businesses in my constituency with the cost?
Yes, we will bear down on any profiteering at the same time as pushing forward at speed for energy independence.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. I can ask the Prime Minister about one particular consequence of this war in the Middle East, and that's the rising cost of heating oil, diesel and petrol. Now, everyone is struggling. I've spoken to many businesses and people who are really struggling to pay their bills, but the UK government and the Scottish government support is only for people claiming benefits. So when will the government reconsider this approach and ensure that everybody, working people and businesses, are also getting sufficient support as well?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we'll set out the plans as they develop. Some of the ways in which we protect and support has to be universal, and in fact the cut in energy bills that's through to the end of June is universal, but we're looking at the most appropriate support on a wider basis.
Dame Chiunwara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Fresh from a weekend knocking on doors, I can confirm to the Prime Minister that on the streets of Newcastle Central and West, there is no appetite for further involvement in this war. Now, there are some, including apparently the leader of the opposition, who say that while they might not have chosen to start the war, now that the bombs are flying, we have no choice but to support our allies. So can the Prime Minister confirm that President Trump's America is not a reliable ally, that the Prime Minister Netanyahu's Israel is not a reliable ally, and that we have to work with our reliable allies in Europe to end this conflict and ensure that working people in this country do not pick up the bill?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we work with Americans on a daily basis on defence, security and intelligence. It's really important that I reiterate that position to the House, and of course we're working with them in relation to the use of our bases to take the action that's necessary to protect our civilians and our nationals. At the same time, we need to work more closely with our European allies on defence, security, on energy and on the economy.
Ben Lake.
The Prime Minister was right to mention the untold economic damage that this crisis has already wrought on households and businesses across the country due to increased fuel costs. But does he also share my concerns and those of the agricultural sector that a prolonged closure of the Strait may also feed through to higher food inflation? And can I ask him what measures the government is considering to help mitigate the potential consequences of a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz?
Can I thank him for drawing attention to that, because there will be consequential impacts beyond the immediate impact on energy, and that's why we're monitoring, keeping under review the steps that we can take. But I go back to my opening point, really, which is the absolute focus has to be on getting the Strait reopened as quickly as possible, because all the time that is closed to free navigation, the damage that's being done is being compounded, and that's why it's really important that we work with our allies to that end.
Justin Madders.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last week President Trump was making the most outrageous and dire threats in order to try and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. This week he wants to keep it shut. So I wonder if the Prime Minister can shed any light on what the United States strategic objective is behind this latest move. What can be done to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and what this government can do more to protect our people from the economic consequences of this mess?
Let me be clear, I want the Strait open, not shut. And that is what we've been working on for the last few weeks and will continue to work on. And that's why when I spoke to President Macron yesterday, we proposed pulling together a leaders-level summit later this year to continue the work they're already doing. But to be very clear with him in the House, that is to keep the Strait, or to get the Strait fully open, because that is the single most effective way to limit the damage that is being done to all of our economies.
Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the Prime Minister was in the Middle East, did the subject of the UK's dependence on helium come up? Because it is an element which we don't produce in the UK and is vital for things like MRI scans in the NHS.
Well, we did discuss a range of issues. I won't go into all of the details, but we did agree that where we're working together already, we should double down and do even more in relation to resilience in particular, which goes to her question, both economically and defensively, and we'll take forward that work.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the Prime Minister's continued clarity on the need for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire. But Israel's tactics in Lebanon, forced displacement, evacuation orders, 165 children killed and 87 medical workers killed, are straight out of their Gaza playbook. Does the Prime Minister agree that in Lebanon, as in Palestine, there must be proper accountability for these war crimes, because this age of impunity puts us all in greater danger?
Well, I'm grateful for her question. It absolutely shows why we must keep pushing for Lebanon to be included in the ceasefire. It's vitally important that we do so. And of course, there must be accountability for all the actions that are taken in any respect in this conflict.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been overwhelmed at
the number of my constituents in Edinburgh West who've written to me over the past 2 weeks about the situation in the Gulf. They are, of course, concerned about their energy bills and the cost of living, but overwhelmingly they are outraged at the actions of all the actors in this: Iran, Israel and the United States. And what they want from their government is more and stronger leadership on the international stage to open the Straits of Hormuz. So will the Prime Minister consider going to the United Nations with an emergency motion to the Security Council to get that done and to condemn the actions in the Middle East?
Well, as she probably knows, we have been supporting measures in the UN over the last 2 weeks, particularly some of those that were put forward by our Gulf allies, and I had the opportunity to discuss those last week in the Gulf. We will continue to work with them and others on building the necessary coalition to do all that we can to get the Strait open.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I welcome the tough stance of the Prime Minister in response to the demands of President Trump to get involved in this conflict, and his commitment that Lebanon must be part of the ceasefire. Our constituents need us to give them hope that they will not have to continue to live in a world which is driven by the uncertainty of when the White House takes to Truth Social. We can do things to de-escalate conflict, and one of those things is to support the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, which he knows is at the heart of much uncertainty in the Middle East. Given that the conduct of the settlers on the West Bank directly undermines the possibility of peace and the possibility of a Palestinian state, will he commit to including their conduct in his conversations about the ceasefire and how we can give hope to people in the Middle East and peace to the people around the world?
Can I reiterate to her in the House our support for the two-state solution as the only way for a viable long-term peace in the region? And, of course, the settler violence is a threat to that. It's wrong in principle, in addition to that, and we'll continue to bear down on it.
Rick Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. For years, well before this conflict took place, members from all sides of this House have called on the government of the day to prescribe the IRGC. Whether it's been the Prime Minister answering or other ministers, there has always been a pivot to economic sanctions against the IRGC. We know that the Iranian regime have found ways through cryptocurrency and fake corporate structures to evade those sanctions. So what assessment has the Prime Minister made of the effectiveness of UK sanctions against Tehran, and on the presumption that those sanctions are failing, what precise action is he going to take to strengthen them?
Can I thank him for his questions? The IRGC has been sanctioned in its entirety. In relation to what more we can do, obviously we've been looking at state-based threats, which will almost certainly require legislation. He will be familiar with the review in that regard. So I think there are further things that we can do, and hopefully we can work across the House on some of those issues.
Liam Conlon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's clear now there was no plan behind this reckless war, and the resulting energy crisis is going to have huge impacts, both here in the UK and around the world. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his cool-headed approach in the face of pressure from the leaders of Reform and the Conservatives to follow the US blindly into this war? And does the Prime Minister also agree with me that it demonstrates how important it is that we finally get off the fossil fuel roller coaster and continue our record investment in green energy?
Thank him on both fronts. It was very important from the start that we made clear that we wouldn't be playing any part in this war, not least because of the consequences. And what the war has flushed out is the need to get off the international market and to have independence of energy bills in this country.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, British drones flew over Lebanon hours before and after the Israeli massacre, which killed at least 18 people in Bekaa Valley City, among 300 people across the region that day. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know no UK drones and surveillance flights have been used to feed operational information to the IDF during the genocide in Gaza, and it is deeply concerning that this may now be the case in Lebanon. Will the Prime Minister confirm if these flights were coordinated with the Lebanese army? Was intelligence shared with Israel or with the United States? What is our armed forces' role in this land grab and ethnic cleansing? And have any weapons supplied by the UK to Israel been used in Lebanon?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been clear throughout, and I'll be clear with him, this government is guided by the principle that any action we take anywhere in the world must have a lawful basis, and that's the principle I've applied throughout this conflict and throughout the time this government has been in power.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I commend the Prime Minister and also the leadership from the Foreign Secretary and also the NSA, I'm sure, in the work that's being done. And I welcome the news about trying to resolve the issues in the Strait of Hormuz. But I share concerns that have been voiced around the chamber here about the situation in Lebanon and also the West Bank. But closer to home, the Resolution Foundation have quoted that median working age households will be hit by £480 additional cost this year. What they're describing in my constituency is the cost of Trump. So will the Prime Minister explain more about what can be done to assist households here in the UK?
Well, the single most important thing is to de-escalate and get the Strait of Hormuz open, and that's why we're working so hard with other countries in order to do so, because the impact that it's having on our economy, and undoubtedly is affected by how long the strait remains closed for, and that's why we have to focus on that.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The price of energy is obviously important, but as important is the security of supply. And whether the government like it or not, over 70% of our energy comes from oil and gas. And the events of the last month must be a wake-up call to them that we must secure our supply. Luckily, we do have a secure supply under the North Sea. But, and although his government ministers might say otherwise, his government's policies are meaning that we cannot produce it. When is he going to get serious about our energy security and end the ban on new licences, end the EPL, permit Rosebank and Jackdaw, and finally get the UK drilling again?
Mr. Speaker, oil and gas will be part of the mix for many years to come. I've been very clear about that. Oil and gas is being produced 24/7 every day in relation to our energy supply, and it's really important that it does. That will be part of the mix. But equally, if we're to get to energy independence, which we need to go further and faster on renewables.
Sonia Kumar.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and commend his leadership in steering the UK clear from the Iran conflict and blockade. During this war, healthcare centres, hospitals and ambulances have been attacked, and the Iranians now face acute shortages of care and medicines. What action is the Prime Minister taking to press all parties to comply with international humanitarian law and end the attack on healthcare infrastructure?
Madam Deputy Speaker, let me be really clear. Any attack on healthcare infrastructure is completely unacceptable, and that is why we've been very clear in relation to our own actions and the actions of anybody else. They must have a lawful basis, and that's the starting point for all of the work that we're doing.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister rightly in his statement referred to defence security and energy security, but he made no reference to food security, which feels like a glaring omission given the impact of the doubling of red diesel on the farmers who produce our food. And I wonder if he's even aware that, outrageously, England is now the only country in the UK and in the whole of Europe that does not use its farm payment scheme to actively support its farmers to produce food. In these troubled times, does he agree with me now that's a glaring omission? Also, will he turn around and change it?
Thank you for raising this. Food security is really important. I mean, it actually comes under energy security in a sense, because it's the energy costs that are pushing or could have the effect of pushing in relation to food security. And that's why it's very important that we do focus where we are focusing on, which is de-escalating the situation and reopening the Strait of Hormuz.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Resorting to violence doesn't achieve anything but has left 2,000 Lebanese dead and 1.2 million displaced. And as the Prime Minister is demonstrating, bilateral and multilateral dialogue is the way forward to get progressive change. Instead of just looking at increasing the defence budget, would he also look at increasing investment in diplomacy and development, which is really crucial in this ever-increasing destabilised world?
Can I thank her? I think that the work we're doing with other countries has to start with the political and the diplomatic. Of course, we're looking at military planning, but you can't have military planning without the diplomacy, because it's absolutely clear to me that the Strait of Hormuz will not allow for safe passage until there's a ceasefire in place, and all of the sectors involved in vessels going through the Strait are clear that they won't be putting their vessels through until that is the situation. So she's absolutely right about diplomacy.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is absolutely correct to praise the service of our armed forces personnel, and I join him in doing so, but they are being let down by the failure to deliver the Defence Investment Plan. That failure can only be the result of either inertia or incompetence within government. Which one is it?
Speaker, I remind they hollowed out the armed forces. They reduced our. They hollowed out the armed forces. They didn't increase defence spending. The last time we were at 2.5% was under the last Labour government. Now we're under this Labour government. So I appreciate all the advice, but after 14 years of failure, I don't really need that advice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. From Iran to Russia, the major security threats we face are pan-European challenges, and the Prime Minister's referenced the need and our intention to work more closely with our European allies within NATO. Can you set out what more we can do to be ambitious with those allies on the continent to strengthen our defence and security partnerships, especially in the run-up to the EU-UK summit in the summer?
Well, I'm grateful. I do think there's more we can do on defence and security, particularly collaborating, cooperating about the particular capability in addition to the amount of money we're spending, and that's what we're focusing on with our allies in the EU.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain's military cooperation with the USA and Israel has enabled Israel to commit acts of genocide against the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people, and has enabled the United States to undertake this massive illegal bombardment of Iran. Could he assure the House that from now on the military cooperation and supply of weapons and parts to both Israel and the United States will be suspended whilst this appalling war goes on in Iran, which is a danger, not just to the peace of the whole region, but clearly a danger to the peace of the whole world?
Can I assure him and the House that the permission to use our bases is strictly for defensive purposes, and in particular to protect our nationals who are in the region. We've got 200,000 or 300,000 of our nationals in the region. Iranian strikes were coming into the region, into the Gulf states that I visited last week, hitting infrastructure, deliberately aimed at our service personnel, and it's my duty to protect them, and I will continue to do so.
Dixon. I'd like to join the Prime Minister in thanking our armed forces who are protecting British citizens in the Middle East, and thank him on behalf of my constituents for his cool-headed leadership and firm decision not to join Trump's illegal war. Could he reassure my constituents worried about the cost of energy that he's doing everything within his power to secure peace, to reopen the Straits of Hormuz and to ensure consumers are protected against rocketing energy prices?
Can I give her that assurance? That's what we've been doing particularly intensely in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll continue to do it later this week when President Macron and I host the summit together.